Join me in welcoming Professor Todd Ormsbee.
Is it working? Very good. Okay. I feel weird with this. I feel like Lieutenant Uhura on Star Trek. So the topic that I'm going to talk about is a little bit different from that. It is related, though. I want to talk to you a little bit today about atheists who practice religion, which then at the end of the talk, I think will give us some ways to think about drawing those alliances that were on that original title up there. So just before I begin, just to give you a little bit of an idea about where I'm coming from in this talk, the first thing, excuse me, the first thing is that go into the light. The first thing is that I'm an interdisciplinary social scientist. So that means that I'm coming from an intellectual tradition that says you can't explain social phenomena from one particular method, that it takes multiple methods to do so. So I do history and qualitative sociology and even some humanistic close reading of texts, those kinds of things, all together to sort of answer social questions. The second thing I want to just make really clear up front is that although I'm going to be talking to you about atheists who practice a religion, I'm not normative about this at all, which means I don't think that you should practice a religion. I'm not here to tell you that atheists should go join a religion. That's not it at all. Rather, I just want to understand why would an atheist practice a religion, and what is the sort of draw or the pull and how they can stay in or not. So that's more of where I'm coming from. And then finally, because sometimes I forget and I speak in technical language, I just wanted to make you aware of something that I will often talk about liberal and conservative religion. And that's because within the field of religious studies, that has a specific meaning. And it doesn't mean political, although it can, but it doesn't necessarily mean political. So when we talk about liberal religion or liberal Christianity, we're talking about religions that took on board the criticisms of the Enlightenment 200 years ago. So they tend to be more rationalist. They tend to reject literal readings of the Bible, for example. They're definitely pro-science. They're usually active in the public sphere. Do you guys follow what I'm saying? So that's what I mean by liberal religion. It doesn't necessarily mean like a Democrat or something like that. It means a religion that accepted the critiques of religion made by the Enlightenment in the 1700s. All right. So that's just my sort of preamble before we get started. So the title that I changed to is, What is a Religious Atheist and Why Should We Care? So that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. In liberal American Judaism, there's a story, a kind of an apocryphal story that people tell. I first heard it when I was in graduate school, and it's about a little girl or a little boy, there's multiple versions of it, who has a grandfather who's an atheist and who's always railing against God and the stupid people who believe in God. But then he goes to synagogue every Shabbat. So the little girl is confused by this. I don't understand, why do you rail against God and you don't believe in God and you're a scientist and a communist or whatever you are, and you then go to shul, and he responds to her, I don't go to shul to talk to God, I go to shul to talk to Maury Rosenblatt. So this sort of notion that you can be Jewish without God in American Judaism is at least 100 years old. So the oldest version of the story that we have is from the 1920s. It's possible that it goes back further than that. In Judaism, more largely speaking, we know from historical evidence that Jews were already having arguments about what the nature of God was 100 years before the Common Era, so 100 years before Jesus was born. We know that Jews were already arguing with each other about what God even was. And those arguments are preserved in the Talmud. And in the Talmud, the rabbis come to the conclusion that, well, it doesn't really matter what God is as long as you act like a Jew, you're a Jew. So the reason why I tell you this little bit of story, and this is, that's quick, and so I'm not, we're not having like a Shabbat service here or anything, but the reason I'm telling you this little story is to just sort of get your mind thinking that religion is or can be something more than what you believe. That there's something more to religion than a belief system, and especially a mythological or a supernatural belief system. Okay, so in the research that Brian mentioned in his kind introduction, I started this research about ex-Mormons. I wanted to understand the process that people go through when they're leaving what's called an alternative religion. Sociologists call it an alternative religion. Some of you might call it a cult, but that's how that language goes in sociology. And so I observed there are two online groups that I observed for a few years. I started in 2007, actually, so quite a while ago. And then in 2011, I decided that I was going to actually get some more depth, so I started doing interviews of people. And my goal was to figure out why, or not why, but how did you leave? Like, what happened in your mind to make you leave this religion? So just for those of you who recently heard the talk on Mormonism, I'm not going to talk about that today, so if you got that already, then you have this background information, which is really cool. What was interesting to me when I was doing these interviews was that more than half of the people that I interviewed, well, first off, it's kind of like a Venn diagram. They were all now atheists. So I was interviewing ex-Mormons who were now atheists, okay? So they're all atheists. Over half of them said, I'm an atheist, but I still feel like a spiritual person. So I was like, okay, I don't know what that is. So I had to interview, like, so what does that mean to you? And so I'll talk about that in a minute. So I still feel like a spiritual person. Then there's a little teeny subset of them who said, I left Mormonism, I don't like organized religion, but I have decided with my family that we are going to practice a religion anyway. So two of the people I interviewed, they and their spouses had joined the Unitarian Church. And another person that I had interviewed, actually I don't remember what church he had joined, but it was another Christian church. And I just recently found out that a fourth person that I interviewed is now converting to Catholicism, but he still insists that he's an atheist. Like, I'm an atheist, but I'm converting to Catholicism. So that's really not what we expect when we think of atheists. So it might be like a teeny subset of atheists who decide to be religious, or in Judaism, it could be a massive amount of people who are atheists who continue to practice religion. So that brings up all these questions for me about what it means to be religious and what a religion is and why an atheist might want to be a religion. And I hope by sort of exploring some of those ideas tonight, we can think about what an atheist community would be. So this seems like the perfect place to have that conversation. And I really am looking forward to, after my remarks, what you guys think about from your position as members of the atheist community of San Jose. I had to read it off of I didn't want to get it wrong. Okay. So one of the problems that we have is that the definition of religion in American English is really narrow. And the definition of the way that we just sort of use it in the vernacular, in our common language, the way we use religion is actually the Christian definition of religion. And it's more specifically, believe it or not, the fundamentalist Christian definition of religion. So the way that we most commonly use religion in American culture is that it's predicated on a belief in the supernatural, and it's usually about God. And then secondly, that there's an institutional connection to it, that there's an organization or an institution within which one believes in the supernatural. From a social scientific perspective, that definition is not good enough. And so what I'd like to do is take you just on a brief side journey into what sociologists and anthropologists think about religion and how they define it. And I think that might help us come back to this notion of atheists who practice religion to better understand why an atheist might do that. And I just want to be clear that none of the people that I have studied were in that kind of religion that you had quotes up there from people. Like, they were specifically seeking religions who wouldn't have a parent who was telling their child that they're going to burn in hell and that kind of a thing. Those kinds of religions have been explicitly rejected. Okay, so the first thing that social scientists say is that if I look at across the world and I look at all of these things that I call religion, and especially if then I add history, so I add the time element to it, I find an incredible diversity. And there's a joke among anthropologists, and it's kind of a dumb joke, but I'll tell it anyway, which is religion is like pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And that's how anthropologists approach religion when they're studying, that it's just too diverse. And there isn't a single definition that actually encompasses all of that variation of human behavior and practice. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is that it turns out that our idea that religion is this thing, and that I can talk about religion separate from family or economics or politics or military, the ability to even think about religion as separate like that is at most 500 years old. It comes from the nationalist movements in Europe following the Renaissance. And it wasn't even really fully developed, I would argue, until the end of the 1700s. So the democratic revolutions that started at the end of the 1700s really sort of separate, in the European mind, religion from everything else. The problem is that when we go around the world, there's sort of two things. That other cultures, when you try to talk to them about religion, they have no idea what you're talking about, because to them it's just culture. It's just who they are. So the idea that you could talk about religion separately from anything else makes no sense to them. And most cultures don't even have a word for it. Like, that's how... So if you think that English does have a word and how we use it, that sort of tells us how different that perception can be. The second problem is that when we study people in Western cultures, in the United States, for example, we find that when they're believing, practicing religions, that they also lose that separation from everything else, and that their religion sort of infuses the rest of their world. Does that make sense? Okay. The third thing that I have already mentioned is that the definition of religion we have actually comes from Christianity and is most like the fundamentalist Christian definition of religion, which means that if we use that definition of religion to judge the rest of the world, that we're basically saying that the fundamentalist Christians are right and that they own the definition of religion. So I would never say this in an academic setting, but I would recommend we not do that we not sort of cede that ground to the fundamentalist Christians. So where we end up with is the sort of, and this is really sort of general, I'm not like doing a graduate class with you here, but we come up with this in social science, this idea that religion is actually four things. The first thing that religion is, it's a practice and a behavior. So we begin with, instead of religion is something you believe, that it's something you do. Okay? The second thing is that it's a worldview rather than a belief. I'm going to come back to beliefs in a second, but in other words, that it sort of tells you how to see the world and how to interact with the world. The third thing is that the truth claims that religion make tend to be parallel with the rest of culture. So the truth claims of religion in American culture, we tend to think of them as this is a religious truth claim, but that's because we separate religion out. Does that make sense? And then finally, and this is the big one for me today and for our discussion, is that religion is an experience that people have, rather than the sort of institutional belief system. So I do want to be very clear that what I am not doing and what social scientists are not doing is saying that there aren't belief systems in religion and that they shouldn't be held responsible for those teachings and what they believe. They should, and they are. But rather what I'm saying is that religion is more than those belief systems. And that if we can see religion as more than those belief systems, then we can start understanding why an atheist might choose to practice a religion. Does anyone have any questions or comments about that so far? Yeah. Yeah. So he said, could you list the four things again? So there are it's a practice or a behavior, something you do rather than something you are or believe. Second, it's a worldview. Third, it's that the truth claims flow with the culture rather than separate from it. And fourth is that it's about experience. And my focus for the rest of the evening, my comments will be in that fourth piece, that it's an experience. Okay. Okay. So by understanding that religion is practice, experience, and worldview tied to social and historical contexts, I hope to be able to more clearly explain why an atheist Jewish grandpa would tell his granddaughter, I go to shul, but I don't go to talk to God, or why an ex-Mormon would suddenly become a Catholic. Not suddenly, it took him 7 years, but you know what I'm saying. It feels suddenly to me like, what, you're becoming a Catholic? Okay. So I'm going to focus on the people that I interviewed who left Mormonism, became atheists, and identify as either spiritual or religious. So that subset of people that I studied. And what I found was that there were three things that kept coming up in the interviews. So three things over and over again kept coming up when I would ask them, well, why do you feel that way? Or what do you want out of that? Or do you know what I'm saying? Like there were these things that kept coming up. So the first thing that kept coming up over and over again was this idea of spirituality. That they thought, or they felt like they were spiritual people, even though they were atheists. Now, for a couple of things comments I want to make about that. And the first is that I'm going to make the claim that that idea that you can be a spiritual person at all is a very American idea. And it has its roots in, I'm going to say, the American Transcendentalist movement, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Some of you might be familiar with his writings in the 1830s. And it's tied to democracy, the idea of individualism and individual freedom and rights. And it's tied to the American tradition of critiquing religion. So I don't know how much of this history you guys know, but almost literally as soon as the Puritans land in Plymouth, Americans are like, oh, I don't believe in that. And then they like split off and start their own church. So I lived in France for a few years when I was a young person, and French people would always go, oh, you're an American. In America, you have 10,000 churches and one cheese, but in France, we have one church and 10,000 cheeses, right? So that's why Americans have 10,000. There are actually, of Christianity alone, there are over 12,000 denominations in the United States. So, but part of this is coming from that American idea that I can do what I want, right? And out of that came a reformulation of the idea of spirituality. So when the Puritans used the word spirituality, they meant the way things were supposed to be, so that you were at one with God. When we get to the 1830s, Americans are saying spirituality, saying like, I can be in touch with divinity however I want to, and I don't need religion to do it. Does that make sense? So to me, when I was listening to these people, and interestingly, there were three people that I interviewed, two British people, and a Scot, an Englishman, and a German, and none of those three talked about spiritual, like that they were spiritual people at all. The North Americans, including the Canadians that I interviewed, all used that word, spirituality. So it seems like there's something culturally specific about saying I'm going to be spiritual, but not religious. So when I asked them about what that meant to them and what they hoped to get out of it, most people used this idea, they kept saying, I just want more. I just want more. Is this all there is? So one of the questions that I have as a social scientist is, do they only want more because they used to be Mormon? So that structure of Mormonism removed from their life, then there's kind of a hole or a gap that they want to fill. But I've been following up with these people for the last 5 years or so, and they're all still talking about this, even though they feel completely disconnected from Mormonism now. This idea of more, so I'm using that word specifically. There's an American philosopher, some of you guys might know, named William James, he also a psychologist, and he wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience in 1906, wherein he talked about this idea of more, that some people crave more. And he put it all in capital M, capital O, capital R, capital E. And he himself was an atheist, and he thought this was really weird because he didn't want more. And so he was studying people who did and trying to figure out why they did. For me, my open question that I don't have an answer to is what that more would look like if you're an atheist, and where it would come from, how you would get it, okay? The second thing that they talked about over and over again was community, and this might be more obvious to you from other conversations that you've had, perhaps, or that with yourself or in your group. So I'm going to use the word belonging, which is how sociologists talk about people's connection to the group that they're part of. And I found a couple of things. Everyone I interviewed said that they missed the Mormon community, but they also all hated the Mormon community. So it was this sort of dual thing, like they missed the belonging. So that's what I found as I interviewed them. They missed the belonging. They missed walking into a room and everyone knew who they were, recognized them, wanted them there, and they were part of that community and they were important to that community. They missed that. And they found from leaving Mormonism what most Americans just sort of grow up with, which is most Americans actually don't have that kind of a tight community. And they were still seeking it somewhere. All right? The third thing, can I just ask how I am on time? Don't worry about it? Okay. I'm good? All right. So the third thing, we can, in the question and answer, we can like build out on anything that you guys want to talk about. The third thing that they kept talking about was what I call meaning. In sociology, the idea of meaning is really important because, and so now I'm going to sort of reveal some of the ways that I think and the way that I do research. So I take an evolutionary approach with this about the evolution of the brain. The way that our prefrontal cortex works to determine causality in the environment, to understand why things happen and what caused things, combined with our prefrontal lobe, which is social, and our ability to infer a theory of mind of the people around us. I kind of went really fast through that. Does this all make sense? So the human beings create theories of minds of everyone else around them to figure out what other people are thinking, feeling, and experiencing. And they also are always trying to figure out why shit happens. Sorry, I have a potty mouth. I've actually been quite good. I haven't said the F word yet. What sociologists argue in the branch of sociology that I participate in, they argue that in interacting in the environment, that humans are constantly interacting with the physical environment and other humans, and that in that process of interacting with each other, because of the way our brains work, we're constantly, necessarily, almost automatically creating symbol systems to explain all of those interactions. And then those symbol systems allow us to communicate them to other people, and specifically and most stereotypically to our children, so that we then pass those symbol systems on generation upon generation. And those symbol systems become the way that we organize our interactions in the environment. For me, those symbol systems are what's important here, because the people that I interviewed were all undergoing what I would almost call an existential crisis, that they had to replace the old meaning system. The old symbolic meaning system didn't work anymore. And they knew they didn't believe in it, and they knew they were atheists, and they needed and wanted a new one. So for a small group of them, they were seeking that in new religious contexts. All right? Okay. So in the end, I'm going to just conclude here. What I wanted to think about tonight with you together, and I hope in our question and answer in our conversation we can really get into this. If we think about those three things that I found among the ex-Mormons who still think of themselves as either spiritual or religious, if we think of that pattern of spirituality or more, community or belonging or identity, and then the third thing of meaning, that it might point us into some fruitful directions to think about atheist communities and the roles that atheist communities can play at an individual level and at a community level, and then in relationship to the larger society. So this is just sort of off the top of my head, but what I would be asking is, what is the atheist community of San Jose providing for its members, and is it meeting those needs that these atheist religious people were saying that they were seeking? I'm not saying it should or has to. That's a question that you guys can talk about. But it's an interesting thing to think about. What is the role of an atheist community? And then secondly, what is the relationship of the atheist community to the larger society? So there are a couple of historical examples that I just want to throw out to you to sort of think about, for some ideas. And I'm just trying to see if I can find. So in the late 1800s, there was a man named Felix Adler. Some of you may have heard of him. He was Jewish, or he was born to Jewish parents, and decided he was an atheist sometime in the 1890s. But in his experience of just sort of living his life in America, he thought that the social structures of the religion that he had left, which in this case was Judaism, were still important. And so he tried to form a kind of religion for atheists. And he called it the ethics, the social structure, without being required to believe anything. So it was called the Ethical Culture Society. It's founded in the 1890s. And it's just something sort of interesting to think about historically, that this idea of having an atheist community is actually not new. There have been Americans doing that for at least 100 years. The second example that I would look to is the American Humanist Association, and I thought it was really interesting when, Brian, you mentioned at the convention that people weren't able to articulate what a humanist or even a secular, is that what you said? Even what secular meant? So that word atheist seems to have the most resonance in our culture. But by looking back at the founding of the American Humanist Association in 1933, that gives us an idea about how an atheist community might see itself in relationship to the religious world. So I would strongly recommend you look up their original manifesto from 1933. I didn't want to read it to you because it would take like an hour, but you can Google it. We have the magical Google machine. And it lays out like the difference between, for what they thought, a difference between a religious person and a humanist would be, but why a humanist, they called it religious humanism. And the people who signed it and the people who created that organization were atheists. So they end up in a place kind of like what I'm talking about here, atheists who choose to practice a religion. And that's all I have for you today, so thank you. So that was a bit of an awkward ending there, but...
So we have this on. Thank you. Hey.
So I really tried to just give you a sort of a brief outline of the people that I was studying, and what I hope is that the conversation now can be really fruitful and yeah.
Yeah. So I think the part of community is something that we're really generating here. I mean, I now recognize almost everybody and know most of the people by name. Gradually, with time, that's happened. The part about meaning, I think that's one we really need to discuss and figure out.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, I don't know if people have any ideas on that and how.
What do we mean?
I mean, what do people get from other religions then? I mean, do you have a suggestion for us?
Yeah, well, I don't have a suggestion for you, sadly, but I think so. When I asked these. It's so cumbersome to say, but when I asked the ex-Mormon atheists why they're now Unitarians or weirdly Catholic, when I asked them what they're getting out of that in this sort of meaning realm that you're talking about, what they all said was really interesting. It wasn't about the specific meaning. So it wasn't, so the guy who's converting to Catholicism right now, I was talking to him about a week ago, and he kept saying, like, it's not about the fact of being Catholic. It's about, I found a community where people are just sitting around talking about what it means to be a human. So he was less concerned about the answers that Catholicism gave than he was about being in a group of people who were asking the questions together. So it's very postmodern of me, but and they all agreed. So, and actually the three who are Unitarians, that's why they chose Unitarianism specifically, because that's what Unitarians do.
So everyone will have their own belief. Is that sort of the idea?
Well, not in the Catholicism part, but it's not really about having your own meaning. Wow, so this is sort of what I was talking about, that you, in interaction, you create symbol systems. So it's not that you have your own meaning, but it's that you're creating meaning by talking to other people. That the meaning is sort of a third thing that emerges out of the interaction.
Well, I can actually, my father was an atheist, and we attended a Unitarian church when I was younger. So I can actually speak this. I actually have Jewish friends in Northbrook, Chicago, who attend a secular synagogue. So all of the things you're talking about hit home for me personally. I have experience with these things. And I was just curious, do you think that some of this desire for meaning or more is just a fear of ceasing to be?
Yeah, it could be. So there's a lot, I mean, well, that's philosophy that goes all the way back, to the Greeks or, to Confucius in China. Like, is this really just about knowing? It's about existential crisis, right? We know we're going to die, that this is going to end. So psychologists would say yes to that. What's interesting for me is that as I've followed these people, so I started observing these people in 2007, and then I've been interviewing people since 2011. And what's interesting to me is that the existential crisis seems to subside. Does that make sense? Like, they sort of make peace with the finity, what's the word I'm looking for? The finiteness of life. Yeah, they make peace with that, and then still are seeking that. So I think it's a possible answer. It just wouldn't be the only one. Does that make sense?
As a pagan for 25 years, I'm
Nice.
out of that now. But the reason that I continued to go to rituals even after deciding I was an atheist is because they were fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Entertainment.
And it was a whole big sense of play.
Yeah.
And then mostly I quit because they stopped being fun.
Yeah. That makes sense. No, I like this idea of fun. So I don't know, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but we were talking about Episcopals earlier. I have a lot of friends who are Episcopal atheists, and it's all about the bells and smells. Like you walk around swinging incense, right? It's like, it's super fun. And I know 2 Episcopal vicars, and they're both atheists. So I think that an element of fun and entertainment is a huge piece of it, absolutely. Yeah.
I think we have an advantage in the Western world that we do isolate religion and define it narrowly, because my friends from China, they profess to be atheists, but really they have a lot of cultural, spiritual, supernatural things,
Yep.
and they don't examine it the way that I think we would here. We would say that's kind of a religious thing, and it either stands or falls on the basis of evidence. But with them, it's more of ingrained in everything they do.
Yeah, that's a good example of what I was talking about with the sort of that religion infuses. When you're outside of the Western European model, the religion just infuses. It's not a separate thing. And also, but to be clear, I don't know your friends specifically, but for many Chinese people who have a lot of those traditional practices, there's no contradiction between that and science. They then also go to work and do science. So, do you understand what I'm saying? So it becomes like... Yeah, okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So I thought that was a really interesting talk, but I was nonetheless disappointed that you changed the subject.
Yeah.
Because I run a group that's dedicated to reaching out,
great.
building bridges to the
For
religious
here at the
community. It's not formally associated with ACSJ. It's called
Okay.
Dialogos. It has its own meetup group. If anybody's interested, come see me after
fantastic.
the show.
Yeah.
But I still would very much like to hear what it was that you were.
Yeah.
What you would have said if you
Yeah.
were going to talk about that.
Yeah.
But we can do that offline if it's too long.
Yeah. Well, I can give you like a brief.
That would be great.
So 'cause what actually ended up happening was just that piece was being set up by this piece, and it was too long. So that's what happened. So, but just very briefly, I think that an atheist or a secular or a humanist community actually, especially in American culture where humanism and spirituality comes from the critique of religion and is non-believing and non-religious at its core, and that's liberal religion, right? So I think that secular, atheist, and humanist communities actually have a lot of points in common with especially liberal religion, and that they really should be, what's the word I'm looking for? Not just sort of connecting with each other, but actually sort of joining hands for social action. Yeah, go ahead.
Finish, and then I have a... Okay, I'll
Go ahead,
we meet in the Methodist Church.
Yeah.
And it's been really fascinating for me because one of the things, for example, that I've learned is that they're atheist Methodists, which came as a shock to me. I didn't know that. So you
It's
actually
a liberal
learn
religion.
a lot of really cool stuff by talking to religious people. They're not all just idiots.
So the Methodism is, so in American Christianity, the liberal side, Methodism is one of them. So the big ones that people know are Episcopalian, Unitarian, Methodism, American Presbyterian, not the other Presbyterian, American Baptist, not the Southern Baptist, right? So like a lot of the churches split or in the Civil War, and one side went liberal and the other side went conservative. And you find atheists in all of them. Hi.
Thanks for the talk tonight.
Thanks.
And what I'd like to say is I've been an atheist my entire life, but for 2 significant periods of time in my life, I spent time in the Christian church, and I wasn't very open about my atheism there.
Right.
But I found that there was a great sense of pride in the community. Developed some great friends out of it, and there were a lot of fun activities as well. But I did feel like I was an outcast.
Yeah.
But a question I do have for you, you use the word spiritual quite a bit. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's the $100 million question, right? So We say spiritual all the time, and have you heard people say I'm spiritual but not religious? Have you heard people say that? It's really common, and to me, when I hear spiritual, I think of like Shirley MacLaine channeling a 10,000-year-old warrior or something or incense in a yoga studio. Like that's sort of what I think of when I hear spiritual. But in the very general, it's kind of like what you were saying. I can't remember who said it, but it's whatever you want it to be. We'll all have our own definition of spirituality. And in a way, that's true, because what Americans did in the 1830s is they said, I can commune with the divine however I want to, and I don't need a church or a religion to do it. And so it became a religion of individualism. So Emerson, who sort of came up with this on the philosophical side, was also the guy who wrote Self-Reliance and was doing his philosophy of individualism too. So when I say spirituality, I mean it in that sort of historical sense that Americans have this underlying idea that they get to do religion however they want to, and they don't even need a religion to do it. And it's so powerful that by the 1880s, the liberal churches and Reform Judaism are all talking about how can we be more spiritual. By the 1880s, the religions have already transformed to match that idea. So it's kind of weird because I'm not actually answering your question. I don't have a definition of spirituality, but what I'm saying that it's that kind of thing that Americans do with religion.
But it sounds like what you're saying is that spirituality is subjective.
It can be, but it also seems to always happen in groups. So that's just a very human, right?
So I had just a couple comments, and one is you talked about the Mormons missing yet also having that, basically a love-hate relationship of their community.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to offer that just today I was reading a very interesting article about a very small town in Vermont of 60 people, in which there's been an ongoing feud for 20 years, yet no one can leave. There's fully 10% of the population is within the governing, chamber of this thing, and they just war with each other to the point where a county sheriff has to be at all meetings.
Wow.
And animals get killed and so on. It's very interesting. So I just wanted to share
like
that.
a sacrifice? They turn the lights down?
I don't know, but I just thought that might be interesting in regards to that, the larger view of that phenomenon. Yeah. The second thing is with regard to the definition of religion, and I believe this would be a philosophical definition is years ago I was in a world religions class, and the professor offered the definition of a person or persons view of their ultimate reality.
Oh.
And I offer that because I've kept that very strong in hand because it informed me that I was an atheist. When I thought about that deeply, I said, well, my ultimate reality is just reality itself. And so I was just sort of wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah. So there's a whole sort of school of thought on the humanities side of studying religion, and please don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying that in any way to denigrate the humanities. The humanities does incredible interpretive and hermeneutical work. So on the humanities side of studying religion, that sounds very much like a common content description, like what is going on within, like interpreting what the religion is, yeah. So that makes perfect sense in that regard. I don't think it's very helpful if you then want to empirically study people's behavior, which is what I do. So.
Yeah, I want to tie together a couple ideas that really resonated with me. One of them was you talked about how Americans or people that are not atheists are looking for, or are not religious, are looking for something more.
Some, yeah.
And some of them, and they consider themselves to be spiritual. I think this is unique to Americans, perhaps. We want more of everything. I mean, we have bigger cars, more powerful cars, bigger houses, more money. You name it. We either are striving for it, and so there's that aspect of it. Americans seem to be dissatisfied more than perhaps in other cultures with their present state, and I think that human beings in general want to be more of who they are. They want to be stronger, smarter, have more knowledge, be wiser, and especially be more content.
Yeah.
And I think Americans also, and this ties in with the idea of spirituality, are idealistic perhaps more than other cultures. And we set these high ideals that we strive for, whether a person's a liberal or a conservative, a religious person or an atheist. And So when you're striving for something that is up in the sky, this lofty ideal, that is sort of related to this striving for spirituality, I think, that Americans talk about. Mm-hmm. But I think that this idea of wanting more is connected with we want to be more of who we really are. We want to be stronger and smarter and so forth. We want to be connected.
Right. What's very interesting about how you said that was that you said that in a very American way. So like everything that you were saying about we want to be more of who we are as people, and like that's a very American individualist way to say that. And I would say the interesting connection you make, which I don't know if you were thinking this, but the language you were using was connecting us to consumerism. And what's really interesting is that consumerism comes from the same place as spirituality historically. So I didn't know that. That's very interesting. I'll have to look into that. Yeah. Yeah.
I think people, when they talk about spirituality, they're saying that they're not money grubbing, they're not gross, they have a finer nature. And
so like a moral.
And as you said about idealistic, they're idealistic. That's what spirituality means, I think, to most people. It's just the opposite of being slogging around in the mud, and this is all there is, and it's too terrible to bear.
Yeah. It's interesting because Americans tend to, and this is very cultural as well, but Americans tend to attach spirituality more, not to morality as much as they do to nature. So do you guys remember there was, I think it was for gum, it was a commercial where a bunch of people were on a whale watching boat and a whale breached and everyone went, oh, it's so spiritual, right? That's the kind of thing that Americans tend to really think about with spirituality, which I think that's a really big difference from other cultures as well, in addition to the individualism you were pointing to. Did you have another one? Yeah.
So I have two questions. First, you kind of alluded that maybe the Jewish faith has more active atheists.
Perhaps, yeah. It's more normal to be an atheist Jew, yeah.
Is there like a spectrum? Do you have some kind of hierarchy of these have the most atheists and these have the least?
Of all religions or just within Judaism?
All religions.
So it's definitely, in American religion is what I know, right? So I'm not talking around the world, but in American religion, it's definitely liberal to conservative. So I'm just going to use Judaism as an example because it will sort of illustrate what I mean. So the most likely to be atheist in Judaism would be Reconstructionist Judaism because it was actually built to be a Judaism for atheists. It's a rationalist Judaism. Reform Judaism would be the next most likely. And then what's called conservative Judaism, but which is actually liberal, would be next. And then you start getting into the Orthodox, and that's where you make this switch over into now it's not okay to be an atheist anymore if you're a Jew. So that would be like modern Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, Haredim, right? So that kind of a spectrum you find in Christianity as well. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And it really does follow that liberal conservative line. And it has to do with how okay it is. And the people that I studied who wanted to practice religion and were atheists, they were seeking religions where it was okay to be an atheist. So they didn't want, except for the guy who's becoming a Catholic. But if I understood him correctly, he's found a liberal parish where the priest doesn't care.
That leads me perfectly to the second question, which is when an atheist exits an organized religion, do they all look for something common when they go back to finding some other religion? Is it related to human nature, or is it related to their previous religious experiences?
Yeah, so now I'm going to be a scientist. I don't have enough data to answer that question. So I would say that Mormons have that pattern, and I would guess that most alternative religions have the pattern that I give. So Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, might follow that same pattern. Christian Scientists might follow that same pattern. Seventh-day Adventists might follow that pattern. But then if I come into more mainstream Christianity, I don't know if it would follow that pattern anymore. I would have to do more research. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious, how many people here used to be religious at some point in your life? Probably over half. Wow. So I think for me, I just want to talk basically about the atheist community. Is that for us?
Should I sit?
No, please stay with me. I think for us, it's a lot about a landing place to be once you leave, because when you leave that, like you said, you're about tradition, you're about culture, family. When you leave that, and a lot of times you're outcast, where do you go? Right? Where do you want to go?
Right.
I think. And something for me personally that's sort of like the thing that keeps me up at night, for you guys, you all, is that I want to make sure that you are inspired when you're here, you're happy to be here, you're excited, you want to do more, and
belong.
Yeah, belong, but also not get bored, right? You know, how many years you were in the, but you went for the fun of it, which is fine, which is great. But you know, we do the philanthropy, and I think that inspires a lot of people to do that.
Yeah.
But again, I think maybe it's because I'm an American. I think there should be more. I want more for all of you. So anything you have as ideas, please let me know.
Yeah, it's great.
Because this is yours. Yeah.
So I have only a beginning knowledge of this because I've only just started researching this, but in talking to, your name just flew out of my head, Lynn, sorry. In talking to Lynn before I spoke, one of the things that is really impressive to me is the sort of range of things that you guys are doing here, which is not what I find to be common in a lot of other atheist organizations, which a lot of atheist organizations are basically, we hate religion, so let's get together and talk about how much we hate religion. And so one of the things that I'm really impressed about with this group is that you are doing those things that would build an actual community, that word community in your name isn't just a word, that you're trying to do that. So. An inspirational leader. You want to talk about that? Uh-oh. Yeah. The atheist Joseph Smith, is that right?
Yeah, right. As soon as I start driving a big Cadillac, you guys can,
I'll wait just your gold plates.
Yeah, where's my gold plates? Yeah, that would help. No, I think you're right, and I talk to people a lot about this, and you know, trying to figure out what it is that differentiates us from other groups, because I do want it to be something special, and if it works, if it's something that's working for everybody, I want to share that and go, hey, this is actually working. Let's everybody try this, because you're inspiring people. You're getting people to get out and do something. And it's not really just about being an atheist and being all angry about it. It's about...
There's a place for that. But,
sure.
But it gets old after a while.
It does. So when that's all cooled off, and a lot of people that come to these events right out of the fire, they're like, I want to be angry about religion. Okay, that's cool. You can vent with friends and you can talk about it. Great. But it doesn't, like you say, create a foundation for anything. We have to have...
Excellent. Yeah. That was in my notes, but I skipped
it. Cheat your notes. All right. Veronica, did you want to ask something real quick? Okay. Here. Let me get you the mic.
First of all, I think I have to say that from the very first time that you organized this group, I recognized that particular vision that I felt made us stand out. And why I continue to be a UU is that in the community that I belong to, we covenant to support each other. And the fellowship provides the mechanisms that we can get to know each other at a deeper level. That is something that I think is still missing here, but I think that's your vision. And that's what excites me about that. And I hope that we can continue this and have a discussion and find ways of facilitating the different ways that we can support and get to know one another.
So I do want to just make sure that I think you guys, you're all smart and you know this anyway, but people really come at community from different places, and Americans tend to generally be distrustful of community. And if you've been hurt by a religious community, like those quotes that you had up there were actually really difficult for me because of my own personal background. That sometimes the kind of community you're talking about is too much for people. So I would suggest, especially if you want to be a welcoming place for people who are just leaving religion, especially an abusive religion, that you might want to have a sort of range of ways that people can get in, because they may not be ready for that level of... Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah.
But then again, there are other people like me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, this came up, a couple comments. One thought is that I think it's really cool in the age of the internet and with meetups and things like that. It's super democratic. Any one of us that wants to plan anything can just toss it out to the community and see who we meet. So that's kind of cool that we couldn't have done in the past to build our community in our own way. And building off of what you said, Veronica, in the philanthropy, one of our early philanthropy group meetings a couple months ago, this came up, and I'm looking at my Excel sheet of all the different things we could do for within our community and beyond. And one thing that came up was this issue of like a member support group, of how to offer that personal support to members of the community in times of need or times of family emergency. And we've sort of set it aside because we're doing other things right now, but it feels like that maybe we need yet another little group or something that could be taking, when we find out that a family member that, is hurting or ailing, or if they need something, well, how do we do that when we're literally, we come in here, we sit and we look up front and yay, so that kind of.
Yeah. No, I wanted to touch on that real quick, because one of the first things that hit me when we started this thing was that, because my sister and my family are all very religious. Mm. So, and my sister, her husband's in the military, so they move around a lot. And whenever they go to a new community or new city, they find a church, and it's instant community. They've got friends and support. People help them move in their house. I mean, it's immediate. So for me, that's what I was looking for. I was like, we need that for the atheist community. We need secular people to be inviting and say, oh, you're new in town. Hey, well, we got a great group going. You should check it out.
We don't believe in God either.
Yeah, we don't believe in God either. You won't get any woo from us. No woo over here. But it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to inspire without the woo, because even though the woo is, we don't like it, it preys on that emotion.
Yeah.
So let's give Dr. Ormsbee a round of applause.
Thanks.
I know you have to. It's 8:30.
It's fine. It's great. It's perfect.